Good afternoon. Welcome to the North Texas Discovery Findings webinar for the Cedar and Denton watersheds. My name is Mia Brown. I am an Environment and Development Planner here at the Council of Governments, and I oversee the Cooperating Technical Partners Program with Corey Mullen, who is also here today. You'll hear from her in a few minutes. And we also have Samuel Otta from Half Associates. This webinar lasts about an hour, and if you have questions at any time, please use the chat box because the lines are muted. All of our contact information is here for all the different people that work on this project for the Cedar and Denton watersheds. Please feel free to email us if you have any questions, and this slide will be available at the end of the webinar as well. So I'd like to just go really quick over what this webinar is going to be about. We'll give a quick overview of the risk map process. We'll talk about COG's discovery activities over the last 15 years. We'll have an overview, and we'll talk about the different Cedar and Denton watersheds and the activities we specifically did in those watersheds, as well as the findings, which is the big reveal. And then we'll talk about base level engineering and where these discoveries are going to take us next as far as projects in high priority communities. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Sam from Half Associates.
Thank you, Mia. So I want to continue with us looking at some of the programs that FEMA has been doing lately. And FEMA is still in the risk map program, and the difference between the risk map program and some of the other programs that FEMA has undertaken is that the risk map program is action-driven and not map-driven. And if you look at the charts here on your screens, you're going to see that it's a cyclical effort, and it starts by identifying risk. And one of the things that FEMA does when it's identifying risks is they do a lot of investment activities. For example, if there's new topo in an area that they have to find out the flood risks, they fly new topo. If there's not enough information about flood risks, they do what we call base level engineering, which we'll talk about later within this webinar. And then once they've identified the risks in terms of finding out the probability of the risks, then they find ways to assess the risks, which means you want to know the consequences of the risks in terms of damages and how it affects properties and lives when there's a major storm event. And then they find ways to communicate the risks. And so we have our flood maps that most of you all know about, where they publish all the flood insurance rate maps. And then most importantly, how do we mitigate against all the risks that we've identified, assessed, and published? And so generally, this is what the risk map program is about. And so for this 2017 NCTCOG project, it was all about discovery, and the whole purpose was for us to capture a more complete picture of flood risks within these watersheds, mainly getting information from the local communities. And so when we look at this chart here, discovery starts by FEMA identifying the discovery watershed. Criteria that they use is based on risks, things like population, availability of new elevation data like LIDAR, or if there's any new topographic information that has been recently flown. And then there's a lot of community engagement activities that goes on. There's emails, phone calls, in-person meetings that go on between the project partners and all the stakeholders within these watersheds. The main purpose is to be able to gather data that is available so we can identify risks on a watershed basis. And then, so during engagement activities, we do things like publishing pre-discovery newsletters, and then having a lot of phone call activities with the communities and stakeholders. Then there's the in-person discovery meeting where we meet and talk in person about all the flood risks within the watershed, things that happen on the upstream sections as well as the downstream sections, and how we can begin to look at flood risks on a whole basis within the watershed. Then the last phase of the discovery activities is looking at everything, all the data that has been collected. How can we use everything collected, use that to identify other risks that we need to be thinking about on a watershed basis. And then everything is compiled into a final report, and then NCTCOG uses that in their final business plans for future studies and mitigation activities within the watershed. So I'm going to turn this over to Corey to talk about some of the discovery activities.
Thank you, Sam. I wanted to give you some background on COG discovery activities. So in 2002, COG became a CTP, where they participated in their first map modernization projects from 2004 to 2008. Then in 2009, the Texas Water Development Board and COG created a map needs assessment. This was a document that outlined over 1,200 new mapping needs, 2,300 miles of stream, as well as 44 million in flood mapping needs. They utilized this document to go into their 2013 discovery efforts as well as the 2017 discovery efforts. And what we really want to outline here is that through our history of FEMA, we lead these FEMA projects and have a leadership through our role as a CTP partnership. We are definitely the community's advocate, and we want to promote coordination and regional planning. Our biggest goal is to just bring more federal funding into the region, and this is the first step. So COG led the Cedar and Denton watersheds. The goals of those discovery efforts were really just to provide information of mitigation planning actions and risk communication, as well as gather information from our communities. Any local flood risks and hazards or current mitigation actions that we might not be aware of, getting all of this data together and collecting it in one place to make sure we're all on the same page. We also held discovery findings for the Cedar and Denton watershed. To give you some background on what we've done to get here where we are today, we had our watershed selected for discovery, and then once that happened, we really led through FEMA developed a watershed engagement strategy and contacting communities within the watershed, which led to our pre-discovery newsletter, just developing more watershed partnerships and submitting all available data to FEMA. Then we held our in-person discovery meetings where we actually were able to meet with all our stakeholders as well as the communities to get any data that we might have been lacking, and then also use this data to create a discovery map and discovery process newsletter. Then we analyzed any comments or watershed for final project selection and identified local flood concerns. This leads into our project area selection. This helps us determine a priority projects for Phase 2 flood risk identification projects, which we'll discuss more later in the webinar. So like I said, we held 4 discovery meetings in mid to late June where we actually went out to communities in the Cedar and Denton watershed for half-day, come-and-go open house style meetings. Those meetings were held in Decatur, Flower Mound, Gun Barrel City, and Terrell. We tried to really spread them out all over the watershed so that we were able to have more attendance. And this is just an image of those meetings. We want to thank all our stakeholders that were able to come and support us in these activities, the Corps of Engineers, FEMA Region VI, Texas Water Development Board. In Denton, we had the Opportunity Water District participate, and then in Cedar, we had our Tarrant Regional Water District participate. All of these had different stations. All of our stakeholders had stations where we'd talk to each entity, and then we'd also have computers set up with our Discovery website for any community members to come in and enter any data, as well as ask questions about that website. And we also want to thank all of our community attendants. We had Terrell, Kaufman County, Denton County, Wise County, Kemp, Rockwell, and others. Now I'm going to hand it back off to Sam, who's going to be talking about discovery findings from these meetings.
Thank you. So one of the things that we want to focus on this webinar is some of the findings that we've been able to come across as we undertook this project. And so when we began this presentation, we talked about the fact that we did a lot of pre-discovery activities, and then we actually did a discovery meeting. And so one of the things that was done for this particular project was to create a data gathering website. And so this website was open to all the stakeholders in the local communities. They could go in, enter data about flood risk, where they have hazard mitigation activities, where they have roads that overtop, where they have issues with some of the FEMA mapping that are on their maps, anything related to flood risks, they could put into that website. And so we went in, gathered all the data, and then there was the actual discovery meetings. And so we've gathered all the data and tried to categorize them. And so if you look at this map within the Cedar watershed, it's been categorized according to most of the community concerns, known areas where there's flooding, and so places where, for example, there's a low water crossing and it overtops anytime there is any major storm events. Areas where you have a lot of mitigation activities. And so look at the Denton watershed, for example, there was a lot of concern that most of the FIS discharges within the current effective FIS within Denton County on Grapevine Lake, the discharges are so small, and so there needs to be a new study on that stream. And so we're able to categorize all these concerns into a database, and it's going to go into final report that's going to come out of this project. And then we began to look at some of the information again and how they were spatially distributed within the watershed. And so if you look at this map, it tells us where, there's been a lot of mitigation activities in some of these communities where they discussed a lot of flood risk concerns, where there's a lot of mapping concerns, for example, whether the mapping matches current conditions or the map needs to be changed. And we did the same thing for the Denton watershed too. One of the things that we started looking at was, how many mapping concerns did we collect, or, how many mapping needs do we have to start looking at in these watersheds. And so if you look at this graph here, you see there's a lot of concerns about flood risks within this watershed. There's a lot of mapping needs. Most communities want to have new studies on their streams. Some communities have identified certain mitigation activities that they have to undertake within their local communities. If you look at Denton, it's the same thing. Everybody identifies that there's flood risks and they have to do something about it. Again, there's a lot of map needs out there that needs to be looked at. And so what happened was, once all this data has been gathered, then we have to find a way to prioritize some of these concerns and needs and find ways to begin to look at them on a watershed level. And so we ran through a prioritization process, which is based on the Texas Water Development Board. The state actually did a map needs assessment in 2009, and they came up with 10 sets of criteria that would be used for prioritizing watersheds within the state of Texas. And so they use criteria such as predicted population growth, areas where population is increasing or decreasing. If you have new LIDAR within your communities, you get certain points. If you have a lot of letters of map change within your communities, then it means you have higher flood risk. And so they look at all these criteria, and then based on that, we prioritize the watersheds based on a HAC 12 level. And so if you look at the Cedar watershed, for example, here we have this watershed is the Upper Brushy watershed. This is the Lazy Fork. This red one is Clear Creek, and this came up as top in these watersheds. Now, this is just a basis of finding how flood risk needs to be looked at on a watershed level within this watershed, and it's just a base whereby COG is going to use these in their business plan to plan studies within these watersheds. And so it's by no means the final prioritization in terms of projects that are going to be done within these watersheds. The same thing was done for the Denton watershed too. And so if you look downstream here within the Grapevine Lake area, you can see the Cottonwood Branch, Denton Creek area comes on top because there's a lot of population activities, a lot of flood risk, there's a lot of mapping concerns. And so those areas came up on top. There's also, this section is actually the Elizabeth, headwaters of Elizabeth Branch watershed. So one of the things that FEMA also invested in during the discovery process in this project is what we call base level engineering. And so when we began this webinar, we talked about the fact that when FEMA chooses a watershed, they do a lot of investment. And so one of the things that FEMA could do is, if there's no new topographic information or no new LIDAR, they can decide, then the first thing we have to do is to fly a new LIDAR. Now, in these two watersheds, there was a lot of new LIDAR that was already available, and so they invested in what we call base level engineering. And so for the next few slides, I'm going to talk about this base level engineering and some of the uses and applications that communities can leverage as they manage flood risks within their local communities. And so what is base level engineering? It is a large-scale automated engineering process to identify flood risks for an entire watershed. And the focus is on the fact that it is automated and it applies to large watersheds. And to use base level engineering, the first thing that FEMA looks at is you have to have high resolution ground elevation data, which means you have to have either new LIDAR topographic information or any new contour information that is available for that watershed. It is an automated process, which means it runs very fast and very quickly, and so within a very short time, you can have flood risk for an entire watershed. And then what does it do? It creates baseline modeling, which is equivalent to approximate zone floodplains that we see on our FEM maps. And then these models, because they are approximate, they are building blocks that communities can use to build and refine those models to get detailed models out of them. And because everything is watershed-based, you begin to look at risks on a watershed-based level. So you are not only seeing risks for your communities, but you're looking at risks that affects both people upstream of you and people downstream of your communities. And one of the things about base level engineering is that sometimes they can actually calibrate the hydrology based on rainfall information that is available or gauge information. And so even though it's automated, the discharges are pretty good to existing conditions that you can use to manage flood risk. So what are the main outputs of base level engineering? One of the things that base level engineering does is you are able to create not just your 100-year and your 500-year approximate floodplains, but you can also create a 10-year floodplain, which is one of the most frequent storms that we have in these watersheds. And then you begin to look at what we call areas of expanded risks, and I'm going to show you some of these in the applications. And then you don't only look at floodplains in terms of whether you are in or out of the floodplain, but you can begin to look at the fact that your actual flood risk varies within your floodplain. And then you also begin to look at how the risks actually affect the built environment and human lives when there is a big storm event. And so here is an example of an approximate level floodplain in Kaufman County as an example. And then you run base level engineering on a watershed level, which means you have new LiDAR, like you see the topo contours on this map. Everything is automated, so you put automated cross sections, and then you run your hydrology and your hydraulics. And so, again, quick, you get base models, which are headcraft-based models for all these streams in these watersheds. And so for every stream in this watershed, there is going to be a model that backs the information from base level engineering. And so you begin to have building blocks that you use as starting point conversations as you begin to analyze existing flood rates within your watershed. And then it allows FEMA to begin to assess the current flood maps that we have on their maps, so that they begin to analyze and begin to say, oh, maybe these maps are old and we need to begin to think about refining or putting these maps as top priority for new studies within these watersheds. And because it's based on a watershed level, it's very cost effective because everything is automated, it's fast, it provides quick data for review of flood risks within the watersheds, and because you're looking at watershed from the perspective of flood risks not affecting only just one community but several communities, it provides a means of collaborating within the watershed. And so here is, again, a FEMA map with an approximate level floodplain on. Once you run base level engineering, because you have approximate models, and then you generate water surface elevations. And so now you have actual estimated water surface elevations on your maps, which provides a very quick way to estimate BFEs for planning purposes. Floodplain managers can quickly be able to identify what their base flood elevation is on a particular location within their communities. And so it provides a quick way of managing activities within the floodplain. And so if a developer comes and it's a zone A floodplain and they want you to give them a quick idea of the 100-year elevation, because you have base level engineering that has cross-section data with elevation in it, you can quickly give them estimates of these values. And then, like I said earlier on, base level engineering doesn't just create your 100-year floodplain. You can also create a 10 and also have a look at a 500-year floodplain. And so now when you look at this map right here, we have a 10-year mapping, and then we have the 100-year mapping and have the 500-year mapping. And this is all approximate level floodplains, but at least it gives you an idea of how your flood risks vary depending on the frequency of the flood event. And then here is another example of the applications of base level engineering. You begin to understand how the risks within your floodplain is varying or changing as land use changes, as people build in discharges changes, and so your flood rates will begin to change depending on when it's mapped and how it's mapped. And so here's an example where you have the effective mapping shown in gray and black and white, and then we have the base level engineering mapping, which is shaded with the blue and the pink. And so you can see where some of the floodplain is increasing and areas where the floodplain is decreasing. And so you begin to analyze how horizontally the floodplain is changing. And so in base level engineering, another layer is developed where we call areas of expanded risks. And so when you bring on the areas of expanded risks, it's combined the effective, which was your old mapping, with the new base level engineering, and produce this data where you can look at this on your screen and begin to analyze areas where your floodplain is increasing, where it remained the same, and where it's decreasing. And so this is a good, quick information where you can use for outreach activities within your communities. For example, if you know the floodplain is going to increase in a certain subdivision, then you provide outreach activities to them and how they can prepare in terms of getting flood insurance, and help you begin to design mitigation activities to reduce the flood risk. One of the other things that base level engineering does is give you another way to communicate flood risk. And so this graphic is just to tell us that, on FEMA maps, these two sets of flooding are the same, because there's no way to know the actual intensity of your flood risk on a FEMA map, because what a FEMA map tells you is you're either in because you have a boundary or you are out. Now with depth grades, you are able to click on a particular area within the floodplain, and then you get an elevation or an idea of the variation of the risk. And so here is an example where we have a floodplain in a subdivision, and so you are either in or out of the floodplain. But then when you begin to see depth grades, you can tell that all these buildings are not having or experiencing the same risk depending on the intensity of the flood. The depth of flooding changes within this floodplain. And for most people, they understand flood rates if you can tell them, for example, when they have a 10-year flood event or they have a 100-year flood event, they're going to have 6 inches of water within their living room, or their TVs are going to be destroyed, or their couches are going to get wet. It makes them understand that better than telling them, they have a BFU or, for example, 400 above a certain datum. And so the depth grades gives you a quick way of communicating flood risks to communities. Again, like I said earlier on, the approximate level floodplains doesn't give you a quick way of assessing or estimating base flood elevation. But with base level engineering, you have cross-section data, and so when somebody comes in and say, oh, this is where my property is, can you give me a quick estimate of the BFE? You can quickly click on the depth grades that I talked about, because we produce what we call water service elevation grades. So you click on the grade and it gives you a quick estimate of the BFE for that property. The other set of products that BLE does is to create what we call flood risk assessment. And so what it does is it begins to look at flood risks not in terms of just the probability of the risk, but the consequences of the risk, and how does the flood event affect the built environment and lives and property. And so FEMA has a program that it calls Hazards, which runs a lot of models and equations, and then you input all your depth grades information and any kind of demographic information in there, and then it runs a lot of equations and then spits out results on how a particular depth of flooding is going to affect a particular census population. And so within flood risk assessment, you have an idea of your demographics and your capital inventory. For example, where do we have residential facilities? Where do we have commercial facilities? And other kinds of buildings. How vulnerable are these facilities, so that we find ways to mitigate against the risk. And so flood risk assessment will estimate the damages and then also estimate losses and needs. And so once you have an idea of, for example, if there's a 10-year flood, we're going to have over 8 million of residential damages, begin to look at flood risks in terms of, oh, how do I want to mitigate against these high losses when I have a particular flood event occurring within my jurisdiction. And so here is an example where, hazards has been run for, the watershed, and you begin to look at flood risk in terms of census blocks. And so you look at this, we have a zoomed-in map, and you see some of the particular subdivisions in terms of census blocks where you have high flood risks anytime there's a major flood event. So in summary, what does flood risk assessment do? You begin to look at building-related losses. How many buildings are going to be, for example, moderately damaged or severely damaged? In hazards, anything above 50% means it's a severe damage. And so you begin to look at some of these losses, total economic losses for your communities. How many people are going to be displaced? For example, when you have a 10-year storm, and you look at demographics. Do you have a lot of older people, or you do have a lot of younger generation? And you begin to plan ahead of time before any major event occurs. How many critical facilities do I have, and how do we protect those critical facilities? How much debris do we have to collect anytime there's a major storm event? And so hazards and flood risk assessment helps you to be able to know these things ahead of any major event. And then the last bit of data that base level engineering collects and produces is what we call the areas of mitigation interest. And so, and basically because we talked about the fact that these models are approximate level models, it doesn't have a lot of structural information within these models. And so base level engineering collects anywhere you have structures crossing the streams and puts them in a point file and gives them to the community so that they can use to be able to have something like a guideline when they begin to refine these models to put in this structural information. Again, the areas of mitigation interest is not just collecting areas where you have structures, but it begins to identify areas where, for example, you've built a new bridge, like we've seen this example, where, they've come in, probably was a low water crossing, they raised the road and then built a bridge over it. So it looks at both the positive and the negative aspects of mitigation. And this is just a tool that, is telling us that, hey, as a floodplain manager, we don't want your work. FEMA is looking and COG is looking for ways to make your work easier, and so that you be confident to do your work when you have questions about, for example, estimating depth of flooding, base flood elevation, and more importantly, in the Zone A areas where it's very challenging to get elevations.
Thanks, Sam. It's hard to follow the rock, but I'll do my best. So now I want to show you all some examples of post-discovery projects that have happened from previous discoveries. What you see on the screen now is a 2013 Village Creek study that involved the cities of Arlington and Kennedale and Tarrant County. And this is something that came out of the Lower West Fork Discovery Project from 2012. And as Sam was talking about earlier, these discovery projects identify high-priority subwatersheds for flood risk identification projects in the future. And so FEMA also calls Discovery Phase 1 of the risk map process, and so this brings us into Phase 2. So in the example from 2013 Village Creek, the cities of Arlington, Kennedale, and Tarrant County, they got new hydrology, hydraulics, and mapping for 13 streams. And I want to bring your attention to the little green box in the lower left corner, which describes the cost match. So FEMA provides 75% of the cost of the study for flood risk identification, and that 25% remaining is a local cost match. But one thing that's really important about that is, as you can see from this example, there's generally multiple communities involved in one sub-watershed study, and those communities split that 25% up proportionally. So generally the communities aren't paying the entire 25%. And so as a Council of Governments, where our job is to bring federal funding into the region, it makes us very happy to be able to have this grant that has such a proportionally low cost match. These flood risk studies can be very cost prohibitive for communities that have been looking for updated maps. And so we are happy to bring these studies in that otherwise may have been out of reach depending on the situation. So to move on to the next example, we have a 2014 Bear Creek study that was South Lake and Colleyville. They got, Colleyville got 19 streams mapped and South Lake had 8. And that brings us to our 2015 studies, which are wrapping up now. Those, that was Lynchburg Creek and West Irving Creek, so that was the cities of Shady Shores, Corinth, and Irving, and they got H&H and mapping for 10 streams. So again, that's a 25% local cost match that's generally split up between all of the communities participating. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is our next steps. Just so you know, as we finish up our discovery, we're going to spend the next few months highlighting potential stream studies. We'll be working on our draft business plan to submit to FEMA at the end of the calendar year. And so we'll be reaching out in the next few months to communities in the Cedar and Denton watershed to see if y'all would like to participate in a phase 2. But that being said, don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have an idea for a study that you would like us to do from these watersheds. And with that, for next steps, I'm going to turn it back over to Sam.
Thank you, Mia. So what I'm going to go through the slides pretty quickly. We want to be able to tell you how and where you can access some of these data sets that have been and reports that have been developed for discovery and base level engineering for the Cedar and Denton watershed. One of the FEMA sites for distributing a lot of information about flood risks is the riskmap6.com website. And so once this project is finalized, everything, all the reports, all the maps, most of the webinars, the newsletters that went out are going to be publicly available at riskmap6.com. It's a FEMA website that is used as outreach to communities, and so I'll show you how to access these and how to navigate on this website. And then the base level engineering is also going to be publicly available on a GIS web map where you can go in and look at some of this data that we talked about. And so I will demo that in a little bit. And one thing about this website is you are able to see flood risks, like I talked about earlier on, but it doesn't just tell you stuff about information about base level engineering. You are able to even assess areas where you already have existing detailed studies. It's able to give you information and reports about the detailed studies for that area. And then the last site is actually the site that we developed for this discovery project. It's an existing site which we use for the data gathering, and this same site also has the base level engineering data there until it's finally published on the FEMA website. And so I am going to get out of the presentation and go to Internet Explorer. And so the first site that I want to demo is the riskmap6.com website. And so you type in this, and we will share all this website information, how to access them in an email to everyone before this project ends. And so you go to riskmap6.com, and then you see these tabs at the top. And what you want to click on is Communities Know the Risk. So once you click on Communities Know the Risk, you get this tab on the left pane where you can find different states. And so as I scroll down, I can go to Texas. And then you begin to look at the counties that you are in. So for example, when I'm looking at the Denton watershed, one of the big counties there is Denton County. And so I can scroll down, look for Denton County. Once you click on it, you see these tabs there. Some of these tabs are some of the earlier discovery projects that were done. And so once you click on it, you can begin to see some of the discovery reports on the site. And so a new tab is going to be created here for Denton Discovery. And then same thing, you're going to see these maps and reports and newsletters and everything about the discovery that was done in 2017. And the same thing will apply to the Cedar watershed. And so make use of this website. If you need anything on how to be able to navigate through this, you can email us and we'll be able to help you navigate on the website. I also wanted us to look at the Discovery Flood Risks Report and see some of the important information that you can actually look at. This information has a lot of write-ups about the watersheds and history of flooding in the watershed. And earlier when I talked about how the prioritization was being done, and so one of the things this flood risk report does is look at how prioritization is done. And so there's a table that tells us the criteria that was used for the prioritization. So this is the table and how the scores were done. And so you can begin to look at this report and see some of these write-ups. The other thing that I want to discuss in these reports is the fact that you can come in and see community fact sheets. And these are one-page flyers that have been developed for these communities in the watershed. And so you can see how much of the community is in the watershed, the population, expected population growth, how many policies they have within their communities in terms of flood insurance, if they have any claims or repetitive losses, it's going to be shown there. Their stream mileage, has there been any federal or presidential disasters declared? Are they participating in the NFIP, things like that. And then on the back of the page is where we look at the hazard mitigation plan and then look at some of the mitigation actions that have been identified within the plan. So you look at the hazard mitigation plan, look at the mitigation activities identified and some of the federal or state grants that can help you fund some of these mitigation activities within your communities. And this has been developed for each community within these two watersheds. And so look at the report. These are draft reports. They are available. We've sent the links out, but then I will show you the link again on where you can download the draft reports. The other side that I want to demonstrate is the FEMA Estimated BFU Viewer website. And so once you log on to the website, you get a GIS web map. And once the web map comes in, just like most web maps that we use, whether on our phones or in our cars, you can always type in an address or any key feature and it will zoom in straight to the location of where you want to go. And so here is an example where I just type in Lake Waxahachie. It just zooms straight to where the lake is, and then I can begin to analyze flood risks in terms of base level engineering information. And so the 100-year and the 500-year flood risks have been classified as low, and then the 10-year is the high, and then the 100-year is the moderate. And so you can click on the map, and there are tools here on the top of the screen, right here on the web map that you can use to navigate, go left or right within the map. And then this drop pin right here is supposed to be your best friend, because when you click on this, it gives you an idea of the location in terms of the latitude and the longitude, and then it also gives you an estimate of the base flood elevation for that area. And so you don't even have to have any mapping program within your office. You can just log on to the website, a developer comes and they want an estimate of a Zone A floodplain. You can just go to that Zone A floodplain, click on the area, and then you get an idea of the estimated base flood elevation. You can also click on View Detailed Report, and what it does is it runs a quick report in a PDF format that you can even send out to people who make requests for you, so you don't have to worry about generating reports and maps in this GIS web map. And so I'm going to let this run for a while. It takes a few minutes to run to generate the report. The other web map that I want to demonstrate is the map that was, the web page that was developed for this particular project. And most of you should have a username and a password to be able to go to this website. If you still don't remember the password, we'll send that to you. But all you need is an email address to enter to this website. And so once you are able to log in, so you have your web address, once you navigate to the page, you type in your email address, and then the password has already been sent out, but we can send that out again. And so once you go in, you say welcome, it tells us that discovery has already been completed, but go to this particular page, you can download the report. And so once you go to the page right here, you can see the final reports are here, which are Cedar and Denton Creek reports in PDF that you can download. And then it tells us a little information about BLE. It tells us to go to the BLE map. And so this is an example of the BLE information for these watersheds. And the reason why we publish them here is The data for Cedar and Denton are still in a queue to be published by FEMA. The FEMA is prioritizing these publications for all the areas that got hit by Hurricane Harvey, and so it's going to take about 2 to 3 weeks to get them published. And so in the meantime, we've published this on the web pages that were developed for this project, so communities can still go in and begin to look at how flood risk is changing within their communities. And so here is an example that I'm looking at mapping on the Indian Creek at Grapevine Lake. And so you can look at the 10-year mapping, how it's changing within a community, and then you can also look at how the 500-year mapping is changing. And as you begin to zoom in, you can still see some of the elevations for the 100-year that are for some of these approximate level mapping in your communities. And then I talked about the areas of expanded risk, where you can see how the floodplain is changing in and out based on the old effective information. And so within this web map, we also have the effective information. And so when you turn both of them on, you can see how the extent of the floodplain is changing in terms of the horizontal. When I turn these off, the layer here, which is called Denton, for example, changes since last frame. This is the one that is going to show you within one file how the flood risk is changing within the horizontal extent. And so you can begin to turn on and off layers on this map and see and navigate your way around. Again, this is a web map, so you can type in an address. Once you type in an address or a location, it will zoom into the location for you so that you begin to analyze how flood risk is changing. Let me come back to the reports that I talked about on the so it's produced a report for here. This is from the FEMA Estimated BFE Viewer, and as you can see, it gives us a snapshot of the area that I clicked on the map. It gives me the state, the county, and then the latitude and the longitude, and then it gives me an estimate of the base flood elevation. And then it gives you additional information about the data and how you can take action to mitigate against risks in that particular area. Now, if this particular area had a detailed study on the effective map, you give me additional information about the actual effective level BFE information for that area and how I can download the effective fair map for that area. And so the BFE viewer just don't give you information about approximate or estimated BFEs, but some of the detailed study information on the go and on the fly if you want to be able to access them very quickly. And so this information, again, is going to be published within the next 2 to 3 weeks on the FEMA platform. And as soon as it is published, we will send out the web links to everyone and how you can access these. In the meantime, don't hesitate to go to the project web maps and begin to look at the information. And then if you have questions, we'll be more than willing to answer some of the questions you might have about the data sets and use them for your communities. The reports are still available on the website, so if you haven't downloaded them yet, please make sure you do that. They are draft reports and they are currently being finalized. And so as soon as they are finalized, it will be replaced with the final versions on the riskmapsys.com website that I demonstrated earlier on. So in the presentation, this is the password to the Discovery website that was developed for this project. But again, if you have a need for us to email that, you will gladly do that. Are there any questions? I'm going to turn over to Mia to handle it from now.
All right, well, if you wake up at 3 in the morning and you have a question for us, please send it to one of us. Again, my name is Mia Brown. You also heard from Corey Mullen today, and then you heard from Sam Otto from Half Associates. So please feel free to email us, any of us, at the emails on the screen. And it looks like we haven't received any further questions, so thank you so much for your time and attending this webinar, and that concludes the webinar.